sure what time it is. Are we ready? Oh. Oh,
I'm
we're
fine,
doing
and
fine,
I'm 2
yeah.
minutes, I'm 2 minutes fast.
That's all right. So we've got some time still. Good.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. You okay with your mic?
I think so.
Brilliant.
That's all working.
So I'll just... Yeah. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Thanks, Paul.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to Beverley Minster for the latest of these lectures, which is covering the medieval and an early modern period of Beverley and area. And Marcus is with us once again with extensive experience in this world. He studied and taught at Cambridge, and what you're getting is very much original research. The archives that he gets into and finds information in is really quite extraordinary. And also we're very happy to welcome back Daniela, who provides us with this lovely sort of period music, period atmosphere. Now tonight's lecture has that rather provocative title, The Naughtiest Nuns in England. And I have to say that I have a special interest in this lecture. I hasten to add, not a general interest in naughty nuns, but in swine, because I lived as a teenager in the next little hamlet across, Coniston, which is on the main road out of Hull going towards Hornsey. But this is when I started my church going. My parents weren't churchgoers. I went to Swine Church, and it was there that my, not only my church going, but my vocation to priesthood was first sort of born and nurtured by the then vicar. So it's a place which has a very special place in my heart. But I suspect we are going to discover things tonight about it during the Middle Ages, which I wasn't told when I was a teenager. So I'm going to hand over now to Marcus for this lecture based on the history of Swine Priory. Marcus.
Thank you. Yes. Good evening and welcome on this cold winter's night, February night, to Beverley Minster. When will it ever get warm? I think this weekend is meant to get a bit better. Going to talk for an hour and there'll be questions and answers afterwards. I always write too much, so I will try to keep my eye on the time and edit accordingly and probably put lots of red pen through half my talk. Let's make sure we get the title right. It is the naughtiest nuns in England, ? I think it's for you to decide how you consider the nuns of Swine. There is only one part of my talk which does require an 18 rating, and it definitely does. Most of it, the sins vary. I'm going to start with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to actually look briefly at Wotton Abbey, and then at St. Clement's in York and Beverley, and then the second two-thirds, will be about Swine. Although Yorkshire is the largest of all the English counties, by the way, can everybody hear me okay? Great. After the Norman conquest and William the Conqueror's harrowing of the north in 1069 to 1070, which was something of a genocide after the Battle of Hastings, suppressing Yorkshire, it was then something of a monastic desert. In fact, Anglo-Saxon monasticism had entirely died out, and not a single religious house remained in all of Yorkshire. The first post-Norman monastic house was Selby Abbey, founded in 1069. Yet by the end of the Middle Ages, in 1536, as the dissolution starts, there were 77 religious houses in Yorkshire alone, with over 1,000 monks, friars, and nuns, comprising over 11% of the entire monastic population of England and Wales. There were 35 male monasteries, 19 friaries, and 23 nunneries, as well as numerous additional hospitals run by the monastic houses. The wealthiest and largest of the nunneries was Swine. In the East Riding, there were 19 religious houses. Monasteries of male monks at Bridlington, Kirkham, Mew, Water near Pocklington, Ellerton near Weldrake, Holton Price, and North Ferriby. There was a double monastic house of both men and women at Wotton near Driffield, 2 friaries at Beverley, Franciscan and Dominican, and 3 in Hull, Austin, Carmelite, and Charterhouse. And the nunneries for the East Riding were at Thicket, a tiny one, near York by Weldrake, Numburnholme near Pocklington, Wilberforce, where I grew up, and I wrote the history of the priory there, Nunkeeling, Yeddingham near Malton, and Swine. These houses drew their membership from the surrounding towns and villages, as is evidenced all too often by the surnames of the monks, friars, and nuns. So I need to picture the East Riding for you, because for the young women of Beverley, the nearest and most prestigious convent was at Swine, which is 7 miles northeast of Hull, by today a more circuitous route, 10 miles from Beverley, or Wotton, a double house near Driffield, 6 miles to the north, and Nunkeeling, 4 miles northwest of Hornsey. These monastic houses existed from circa 1100 right up to 1540, so the better part of 440 years. And I've been trying to do some imaginative arithmetic this afternoon to try to calculate how many monks, friars, and nuns passed through them during that entire period. And during that time, probably 10 to 12,000 monks, friars, and nuns, collectively known as the religious, passed their lives in these powerhouses of prayer, contemplation, and devotion. And in addition, each house had lay brothers and lay sisters who lived and helped in the day running the house and its estates. And that would more than double the entire monastic population. So you have about 20 to 25,000, and that's the most conservative estimate I've come to. Together with the ordinary secular clergy, what's the distinction? Secular means an ordinary parish priest, chantry priest, vicar. They're secular. Religious means that they have taken monastic vows in some form or other. Collectively, this group of people actually makes up 5% of the entire population of England. 1 in 20 people. So pretty much everybody knows somebody, or is related to somebody, brother or sister, nephew or niece or cousin, or has grown up with somebody and played with them who actually is now a member of a religious community. So they are very much embedded in ordinary people's lives. And that's a very important point to remember. Now, I'm going to make a couple of qualifiers, because I know what's going to come next. For the vast majority of England's religious throughout the Middle Ages, there is no reason at all to suspect that they were anything other than faithful, holy, devout, and honest. Scandals were rare and were swiftly dealt with. The most frequent problem was that of apostasy, which was basically running away, a runaway religious escaping. But this was also in itself quite rare, but it's the most common serious sin we get. And it did actually mean that you were an outlaw from the state as well as the church, because your monastic vows were just as important as your wedding vows, and a vow once made in the Middle Ages could not be unmade, unless you got it specifically from the Apostolic Penitentiary from the Pope in Rome. Now, there were freedoms and privileges afforded to the religious life, and they certainly, and this is another important point to remember, they certainly enjoyed a longer life expectancy than most, if not all, the population of medieval England. If you wanted to live a good old age, you don't want to be a king. Kings don't tend to live that long. 1 in 3 of them don't even die in their beds, they're bumped off. You want to actually be a monk or a nun or a friar. And they do enjoy some degree of comfort. The monasteries largely fall because of their growing wealth. But, and it's a big but, the life of a monk, nun, or friar was hard. It was rigorous, with very, very little sleep, no privacy, and it was deeply sacrificial. I often thought myself, when I was much younger, about being a nun. I thought about the vows. I thought, well, I probably could cope with the poverty. And as a student, you get used to that. The chastity, ultimately, I could get my head around that, although it would be difficult not to have a family. But obedience, that would be the hardest vow of all. To actually be told to do something you violently disagreed with and you couldn't even argue back. So that is quite restrictive. And the monasteries, of course, apart from the friars, were enclosed houses. The monasteries did, however, have contact with the outside world, and they couldn't not, even if they were enclosed, because they were the welfare system of the day. They provided the hospitals, which were sometimes really quite effective in their medical help. The largest hospital was in York, St. Leonard's Hospital, which was run by monks. They provided schools, and they provided education. They provided employment. They gave pastoral and spiritual care to people. They offered hospitality to pilgrims, merchants, and other travelers so they could stay. They were the hotels on the road. And they even offered legal advice on practical matters before the courts, a bit like the citizen advice service of the day. If you were having a dispute with your neighbor over a boundary dispute or whatever, you'd go to the local priory, the mother prioress or the abbot or the prior or a monk there, and ask for their help in drawing up documents, reading letters to you, translating for you, representing you in court, all sorts of things. So they do provide a massively important service. But it also means that they are in contact with the outside world. And that purity, that spiritual utopia, trying to escape the outside world, particularly in the case of nuns, means in these day-to-day activities they do come into contact with the world of men. And that's a bad one. However, monks, friars, and nuns, it should be remembered, are also human and open to both sin and temptation. And for some, moments of weakness of varying severity. And, of course, every casket of apples does contain some bad ones. That is human nature after all. Swine Priory faced 3, if not 4, obvious and particular temptations. One, its comparative wealth and the fact it drew its nuns from the wealthier and the leading local families of Yorkshire, in particularly, significantly from the Percy family and the Neville families, who later on will start a feud which will develop into the Wars of the Roses. And sometimes this feud is being worked out in Swine Priory, as one group of nuns from the Neville family try to undermine the prioress who comes from the Percy stable, and vice versa. 2, Swine Parish Church, which is actually the Priory Church, I never managed to get into because it's always been locked, but I have seen photographs, has some wonderful tombs and monuments to the local Hilton family, the knightly lords of the manor. And these were very naughty people indeed, and they will come up. They had corrodies, which was basically a pension from donations of land and money they'd given to Swine Priory, so they could live there in their old age with food and drink provided for them, up to a gallon of wine a day for the rest of their lives to actually exist. And Sir Robert de Hilton, in particular, was reported in 1267 that he was allowed to wander around the nunnery at will. So you can see that this could cause considerable problem. 3, I don't know if you'll pick this up, Peter, yourself, it's often overlooked, and it's something for us to get our head around, that Swine, which was founded in 1143 to 1153, somewhere in that 10-year period, we don't know quite exactly when because it's during the anarchy of King Stephen's reign, founded by a man called Robert de Beverley, it was, for the first 120 years or so of its existence, in fact, a double house of men and women. So you had canons, who were monks who were also priests, but had taken monastic vows, in adjoining accommodation to the nuns. And then, as I told you before, on top of this, you've got lay sisters who were helping the nuns with various menial tasks, with other tasks, in farming and stuff like that. Cooking, washing, and you have lay brothers helping the monks. So that's just doubled everything. And this continues until 1280, when it mysteriously stops. But you can see the chances for misdemeanor are unmistakable. It is a remarkable coincidence, I don't know if it's just meant to be ironic or a surprise, that I'm sure you all know your Bible and you're in the right place to learn it, but Jesus says in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, verses 6 to 7, Peter, "Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you into pieces." Not quite clear what Jesus actually means by this, but as you hear later on, it couldn't be more appropriate for Swine Priory. Now, I'm going to backtrack a bit from Swine, because it's partly chronological, and this is the 18-rated bit, which actually quite clearly one, which is the story of the Nun of Wotton. Wotton, of which parts of it still survive, near Driffield, the abbot's house there, a beautiful place which you can walk around, was also a double house, a Gilbertine house, founded by Gilbertine of Sempringham in Lincolnshire, and it was one of their very first houses. And it's the only native English monastic order to ever be founded. Now, the Nun of Wotton was a story which is both miraculous and it is also both true, literally true. for you to work out and decide which bits are accurate and which bits have been embellished for spiritual reasons. We are talking about a monastic community who have given their life to prayer. But the nun of Wotton, born in the 1140s, was a young nun who, according to an account recorded by one of the greatest of Yorkshire saints, St. Aelred of Rievaulx, who was a contemporary and who was the head of the Gilbertine order in many respects, of which Gilbert had founded it under him. He was from Rievaulx Abbey up by Helmsley, writes and records this story, and he's normally very reliable. And this young nun was impregnated by a young friar and miraculously cleansed of sin. The account runs like this. The nun was admitted to the Gilbertine monastery at Wotton at approximately 4 years of age, upon the request of Henry Murdoch, who was the Archbishop of York. Now, nothing's known about her family. However, the fact that Archbishop Henry took a particular interest in her, as well as her stature as a nun at such an early age, as opposed to being a lay sister, suggests that she was from the higher nobility or upper ranks of society. At this time, at the very beginning of the Gilbertine order, their policy on accepting children into their community was less strict than many other contemporary orders, although it would become stricter later. There always was a problem. You have lots of children in the Middle Ages, the average family, and when you've had about 4, 5, 6, what do you do with the younger little ones, little boys and girls? Well, I'm afraid all too often they're going to be packed off to a monastery. And that's not just the rich people, because it's not free. You have to give an endowment to send your child to the monastery. Just as you have to give, what's the word? A dowry, that's it. When you get married, you have to give an equivalent thing to the monastery, because they're going to feed and look after your child for life. So even poorer families, and there's quite a middle class in the Middle Ages, but even sort of upper working class families would sometimes try to, and they'd be very proud to have one of their younger children sent off to be a young monk or a young nun, because they'll get an education for a start. They'll be taught how to read and write, and Latin as well. So actually they're very, very useful to have, because most of your other family members won't be able to do that. There was a phrase used sometimes in the Middle Ages, particularly for the role of women, because women, and it's the women of Beverley who are going to end up with this fate, often really had only 3 options in life. One was to be a wife, one was to be a whore, and one was to be a nun. And the freest of these was to be a nun. Because as a nun, you could rise up and become the prioress, or even just the sub-prioress, or even just the sacristan, and nobody could boss you around from the world of men. Quite the opposite. You could boss around men in your village. You could boss around the blacksmith and the carpenter. You could run your own estate. You could even be at court. So the freedoms for you to run a medium-sized business, such as Swine Priory, were considerable. Anyway, back to this poor nun at Wotton. Now, according to his report of the senior nun's comments, this young 4-year-old girl, whose name we don't know, grew up into being a rebellious young woman, and she soon made the acquaintance of actually a lay brother in the attached male community, not a full, fully flowered monk. Meeting him when some of the brothers, to whom the cares of external affairs were entrusted, entered the nunnery to do some work. And one of these brothers, described by Aelred as more comely than the others in features and more flourishing in age, captured her attraction. And after a series of discreet exchanges, they arranged to meet at night at the sound of a stone or a pebble that the brother promised to throw onto the roof or the wall or the window of the building where she was waiting. Oh, that's romantic, isn't it, really? Sucking up. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, the two finally managed to meet. According to Aelred, this wonderful way that the medieval world has of summing up something carefully so it doesn't sound rude, She went out a virgin of Christ. She soon returned an adulteress, clearly indicating that their furtive relationship had been consummated following their encounters. And the lovers continued to meet secretly until eventually the other nuns became suspicious of the repeated noise of these stones being thrown by the man at the wall of their convent. He must have missed several times. Well, even hit the prioress's chamber by accident. And they challenged the young nun, who confessed to her sins. Aelred then goes on to describe the fury of the nuns, who seized and beat the young woman in punishment for her crime. They tore her veil from her head and were prevented only by the senior sisters from burning, flaying, and branding the young nun alive. She was then chained by fetters on each leg, placed in a cell, and fed with only bread and water. The male culprit fled from Wotton. However, his subsequent whereabouts were revealed by the nun, and he was then tracked down by several brothers from Wotton, who captured him, and this becomes almost like a carry-on film, by having one brother impersonate the culprit's lover and lure him in, whilst the other brothers lay in wait to attack, which they do so successfully. After the young man was captured, the nuns, filled with religious zeal and with a desire to avenge their injured virginity of their convent, engaged in a brutal attack of the offending brother. Poor boy. He was taken by them, thrown down, and held, whilst his lover was directed to stand by. She was handed an instrument, presumably a knife of some sort, and she was forced to castrate him. At this point, one of the senior sisters snatched the newly severed genitalia and thrust them into the disgraced nun's mouth, and she was made to eat them. That's the 18 bit. Do apologize, I'm just the messenger. I only researched the history, I didn't create it. Now, following the castration, the young man was returned to the brothers and the nun was put back into her prison. Henry Murdoch, Archbishop of York, who had brought her to the priory, this is obviously when that now changes, now we get the religious bit of the story. There is actually no doubt, really, historically, what I've told you is true. Those events did happen. It's the bit from now on, we're putting a spiritual gloss and trying to turn this into a moral story to try to make sense of this. But actually, I know that Aelred and Gilbert and Henry Murdoch are absolutely, completely furious with the nuns for this treatment of both these two individuals. In fact, St. Aelred will go and write a whole treatise on spiritual friendship and kindness because of this deplorable pastoral care which has been shown. Because the medieval world did have some standards, and these go way beyond them. But this is the tidy up bit. So Aelred then says that Archbishop Henry appears to the nun in her dreams, in her sleep, instructing her to confess all her sins and recite psalms all night. He returned to her again on the following night, just when the nun was about to give birth, and he was accompanied by two heavenly women who took away the baby and cleansed the young nun's body of sin and pregnancy, and this caused her chains and fetters to fall off. The next morning, her caretakers found her healthy, clean, and distinctly not pregnant any longer. And after thorough inspection of her cell, they found no evidence of a birth at all. Additionally, the chains and fetters that had previously held her had fallen off. After Gilbert was informed of these miraculous events, he consulted Aelred before proceeding. He investigated and declared the event to be a miracle, since she could not have been freed by others or by herself without the strength of God, and therefore it would be sacrilegious to imprison her again. He fully accepted the authenticity of the previous events described to him and deemed the miraculous delivery of the child and the freeing of the nun to be more important than any further punishment. However, he was intensely critical of the nuns' fellow sisters and their lack of pastoral care. Now, it doesn't take a huge brain or historian to work out what's probably happened here. that during the night, two heavenly women, probably two sisters, two nuns, together with another monk looking like an archbishop, have gone in at night, have removed the child. Maybe she's been drugged, practiced medical care, have removed the fetters, have created what would seem to be a sudden miracle, particularly since we're told that as she was about to give birth, so they must have waited 9 months for this to have happened, so she must have been 9 months in the prison cell, and we can work out how this has been turned into a story. Now, that's the story of Nun of Wotton. Now I'm going to tell you the story of Joan of Leeds. Joan of Leeds is later on in the early 14th century, and she was an English nun who was unhappy with her monastic and enclosed life, and at some point in 1318 escaped from St. Clement's by York Priory to journey to Beverley, where she was accused of living with a man. To escape, she feigned mortal illness and constructed a dummy of herself, which her colleagues buried in holy ground in the graveyard of the Priory in St. Clement's in York, which is not too far away from where the current Castle Museum is. When the Archbishop of York heard of this, he wrote to the religious authorities in Beverley expounding upon Joan's faults and instructing that she be returned forthwith to St. Clement's. Now, we don't know if she did ever return, and all that is known of her life and career come from 3 letters in Archbishop Melton's register, who was probably the greatest Archbishop of York, one of the most diligent, pastorally caring, and successful Archbishops of York throughout York's entire history. So Joan of Leeds had been resident in St. Clement's, a Benedictine nunnery, and this is a very, very recent discovery, which historians have only discovered in the past 5 years, this story. We do still find out more and more stuff about the Middle Ages, and probably one of the most under-researched areas of church history in English history is the history of nunneries and history of convents. We know far more about the monks, we know far more about the friars than we do about the nuns, but we are beginning to make some considerable headway on it. So these letters made the news in quite a big way just back in 2019, and it became quite a big story on the BBC News and the Times and the Guardian and all over the place. So I'll develop it a bit more. So tired of her monastic life, Joan faked a mortal illness, and she faked her own death by creating a dummy in the likeness of her body to be buried instead of her corpse. A number of Joan's fellow nuns were clearly brought in to help her, probably her best friends, and aided and abetted. But it's not clear whether they did so willingly or whether they were tricked. Believing, or pretending to believe, that Joan was dead, and perhaps being deceived by the dummy, they buried her in a sacred space amongst the other dead nuns of St. Clement's. And this is recorded by Archbishop Melton. We don't know at this point her motives and desires to escape, but the Archbishop put it down to a desire to follow the way of carnal lust, which she was unable to do in orders, having taken vows of poverty and chastity. Caitlin Moran in the Times, actually, when this was first published in 2019, it was the University of York, Professor Sarah Rees-Jones, that discovered this. The Times correspondent wrote, "Tired of life within the walls of her convent, one nun did what anyone disillusioned with her job would do. She faked her death, made a lifelike energy to be buried in her place, and fled her job to go abroad to live a life of carnal lust." The Times. Joan was eventually discovered in Beverley. And we now go about 3 or 4 years later, in just 2023, 2024, when more documents are translated and described, where she is discovered largely through a rather unfortunate choice to trust a man, trust a priest, in the confessional, and this should have been kept in the confessional, that she had been living indecently with a man in Beverley. And when this became known, I'm afraid this priest, who may well have been a chancery priest here in Beverley Minster, broke the news to the Archbishop, because he thought it was a conflict of vows. So the scandal became known locally, and Melton instructed her to return to the priory and wrote a letter. He wrote, "Out of a malicious mind, simulating a bodily illness, she pretended to be dead, not dreading for the health of her soul, and with the help of numerous of her accomplices, evildoers, with malice aforethought, crafted a dummy in the likeness of her body. She had no shame in procuring its burial in a sacred space. She perverted her path of life arrogantly to the way of carnal lust. Having broken her vow, she discarded her religious habit and now wanders at large to the notorious peril of her soul and the scandal of all her order." Now, again, it's just a question of apostasy. It's quite an impressive apostasy story, faking your own death and being buried and then being dug up by your associates. And then after that, I suppose you just walk out. You just walk out the priory gates, because everybody, one, thinks you're dead, so nobody's going to chase you. and nobody's expecting somebody to come up out of the grave. And if they did, they'd probably think it was a divine apparition or something like that. But apostasy was actually a crime, not just from the church's point of view, but from the state's point of view as well, and even continues so after the Reformation. So actually the sheriff and his posse will now be sent out by the Archbishop of York to go and apprehend this young nun and her lover and force her back to the convent, because those vows are lifelong, and the state is ruling on that. Whether she did ever return remains unknown. I think probably not. She probably managed to hide somewhere in Beverley. Beverley, don't forget, was the second biggest town in all of northern England in the Middle Ages. And she may have been quite well connected to Beverley friends, or maybe she eloped. Maybe she went down to Hull and took a ship to France, to Holland, to Belgium, to somewhere else. The Archbishop himself considered that he had fulfilled his duty in demanding that she returned, and he doesn't really make much of an effort to follow up on his orders and edicts, because, let's face it, he's got better things to do with his time than deal with one runaway nun. There is a great study by Cambridge University Press, which is a great book, available in all good bookshops, which is worth looking at, called Runaway Religious in Medieval England, circa 1240 to 1540, and it's got a list of all the nuns, and it largely is based on the Diocese of York, but it actually does look throughout the entire country of monks, nuns, and friars who have run off and broken their vows, and why and what happened to them. But it was published before the Joan of Leeds story. Joan was not actually the first fugitive nun that St. Clement's by York had to deal with, because in 1301, just 17 years before, another nun, known only as Cecily, had met a group of mounted men by the priory gate. Throwing off her habit, she put on an ordinary gown and escaped to Darlington, where she lived with one Gregory de Faunton for the next 3 years before she was caught and dragged back. In 1310, one of the nuns, Joan de Saxton, had been punished by Archbishop Greenfield of York, Melton's predecessor, for unknown offences, but which probably involved immorality. Although the punishment was subsequently reduced, Greenfield wrote to the prioress laying out certain conditions for Joan de Saxton's future conduct. And amongst those restrictions, she was brought back. She was not allowed to leave the cloister ever again, except when accompanied by other nuns. She was forbidden from receiving any visitors and from having anything to do with one Lady de Wallet. And if Lady de Wallet were ever to visit Clement Thorpe, de Saxton, the nun, Cecilia, was to be sent away. So quite what was going on there, there's going to be some assistance from the family or from a family member in this. And you can see all these cases, they're young nuns, very young nuns. Now, technically speaking, you had to be 16 to make a vow of profession. The vow of canonical obedience was 16. The vows of consent for marriage for a girl was 12, basically puberty, and much the same for a boy. But in reality, most men and women in the Middle Ages didn't actually get married until 17, 18, 19, even 20. Not so different as it would have been in the 1980s. And partly for obvious reasons that childbirth was such a dangerous thing that you didn't want to have a young girl go through that experience, which is the most dangerous thing that can happen to them. But 16 was the canon of obedience, but in the case of the nun of Watford, she was only 4. And it's clear that in Clementhorpe, the Archbishop finds it necessary to order the prioress, to forbid the prioress, to forbid girls under the age of 12 come to the priory, except when absolutely unavoidable. Now, the story of Joan of Lees, as I said, came to light initially from a research project in the University of York's Borthwick Institute for Archives in 2019, headed by Professor Sarah Rees-Jones. And they come from a study of the Archbishop's registers and a translation of them, which is an ongoing project for the first time, and we will find more and more of these. But Sarah Rees-Jones herself, you know her, she describes Joan's tale as extraordinary, almost like a Monty Python sketch. Now, I'm going to come to swine. Gosh, I've already gone for 40 minutes, I can't believe it. Right, so I'm going to start cutting stuff. Swine, I've already told you, was founded in 1153, over a 10-year period, 1143 to 1153. It is the largest and wealthiest of the Yorkshire nunneries. And here's something on the plus side of the nuns, because whatever you're going to think about them later on, the nuns of Swine were, don't forget my quote, do not cast your pearls before swine, lest they turn on you, trample you underfoot, and tear you to pieces. Now, you didn't mess, actually, with the nuns of Swine. They had powerful patrons and powerful backers from the Percy and Neville family, and they would stand up for their rights far better than most of the surrounding monasteries or friars could do. They were so fiercely and jealously protective of their rights and their property, particularly of their lands and rents and watermills and windmills, that they developed a reputation for being very brave and very feisty in legal action and complaints. And when they started something, they wouldn't stop. They would appeal about some dispute, particularly with the neighboring monks at Mew Abbey, which was a large, wealthy house, that even if it's just several acres of land that's in dispute from somebody who's gifted it, or about the monks changing their watercourse or building a dike, which ends up flooding some of the nuns' lands. The nuns would appeal to the local court, to then appeal to the Archbishop of York. If that didn't work, they'd appeal to the king. And if that didn't work, they would appeal to the Pope. And they would keep doing this until they won. And invariably, they did win. And in a patriarchal, male-dominated society, this was incredibly impressive. The nuns actually really did stand up for themselves. There's a nun at Wilberforce who actually, I mentioned in a previous talk, who is called Marian, in much the same period, in the 1320s, who is conned out, her family is conned out of their inheritance, which should have gone to her and then to the convent of Wilberforce. But the Sheriff of York, the Sheriff of Yorkshire, who's a very wicked man called Gerald de Salvain, who is one of the wealthiest and most corrupt individuals. He really could be the role model or the base of the Sheriff of Nottingham. He goes around confiscating people's estates, just saying, no, actually, because you'll become a nun, all your lands and properties from your parents and now dad comes to me. And she ends up taking him to Parliament. And she goes down to Parliament in London just by herself. She's not a prioress, she's just an ordinary nun from Wilberforce, which is the second poorest priory in all of Yorkshire. Complains to the king. Not only does she win her case, but she actually gets the Sheriff of Yorkshire not just fired, but imprisoned and forced to pay a fine to the king of £2,000, which is equivalent to probably about £20 million in today's money, just because of this nun called Marian. All we need now is Robin Hood, don't we? Maid Marian, Sheriff of Yorkshire, Sheriff of Nottinghamshire. Nottinghamshire was actually part of Yorkshire in the Middle Ages. But in the case of the nuns at Swine, they have loads and loads. And time will not permit me to go into a huge debate about this. But their neighbouring Abbey of Mew in Holderness, there was one particularly remarkable dispute in November 2011. And it's a seemingly minor dispute to begin with, and it's recorded actually in Mew's own chronicle by its own abbot. So actually this is the Mew side of the story we're getting, which makes it even more convincing, because we haven't heard Swine's side because their chronicles have not survived. But the Chronicle of Mew is one of the best, most reliable and most detailed accounts of all the chronicles in medieval England and runs into 3 volumes in translation. It's a dispute initially about the monks make a dike through the middle of their land to direct watercourses and try to drain the marshes of Holderness. And as a result of this floods some of the nuns' lands adjoining in Swine. And then the monks are given a legacy by a local landowner called Amandus Picerna of various lands and his body for burial to the monks of Mew. Now, the nuns are the only people who the monks have been careful enough to actually ask permission of all the other landowners to build their dike, and they've all agreed to it, because it's necessary, apart from the nuns of Swine, who have just been difficult, said no, can't do that. But Mew benefits, according to their own abbot, to this generous gift of land near the dike from Amandus Picerna and his body for burial in Mew monastic church. Quite why they do this. But in response, 2 of the nuns of Swine, covertly and under the cover of darkness and with violence, together with a layman who we know the name of Sieur de Sutton, broke into Mew Abbey at night, dug up or stole Amandus's body, took it back to Swine, and buried it in their own convent. A complex legal battle in the courts followed. And this is when the nuns actually take the case to the Archbishop, to the King, and to the Pope, and ultimately, the Abbot of Mew admits that judgment was given in favor of the nuns, with a stipulation that Amandus's body was to remain buried at Swine, and they were to receive the gifts. So, and that's from the Mew side. So there's no reason to doubt it. Because this abbot must have been mortified. He's been bested. And Mew is a spectacularly wealthy Cistercian house, almost as wealthy as Rievaulx and big as Byland in its day. Unfortunately, nothing now remains because all of its stonework was used in building the defences for the Kingston upon Hull during the Henry VIII's reign. But whatever we think about the nuns of Swine, is they held their own. But they were, for a while, a double order. And I'm going to drop a bit. And most of what comes later comes from the Archbishop of York's visitation returns. And in 1267, 1268, Archbishop Walter de Gifford, who built a fair bit of the current York Minster, visited Swine on the 13th of January, 1268. And this leads to an astonishingly long list and litany of faults, which actually I've called the 14 points. The 14 points or the 14 faults. I think, if I remember my O-level history, last to do it, wasn't the 14 points Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations? He drew up 14 points. Well, Archbishop Gifford has brought up 14 points or 14 faults with the nuns of Swine. He found that 1, Amice True was a slanderer. She was untruthful, careless, hurtful, and rebellious towards the convent, and so were nearly all the others when the faults of delinquents were made known in the chapter, to such an extent that the prioress, without the help of the Archbishop, was unable to effect any corrections or any observance of the rule required. Silence was not kept in the church, or the cloister, or the refectory, or the dormitory. 3 nuns, sisters by birth and profession, by name Sybil, Bella, and Amy, often rebelled against the corrections made by the prioress. And 3 other sisters, notice the surnames here, Alice de Scruteville, Beatrix de St. Quentin, and Maud Constable, joined them. The sick nuns were badly provided for and had little more to eat than those who were well had in the refectory, depending on who served them. Though Sieur de Sutton who's the son of the guy who helped them steal the body from Mew, had formerly given half a bovate of land, which is 20 acres, to provide explicitly for sick nuns and sisters. Alice Brew and Alistair Adderburn had received their veils by bribery. Money was given to the convent out of charity for pittances and purchasing shifts, chemises, and other necessities. The prioress received, and it would be better kept by two honest nuns than the prioress spending the money on her own wardrobe and putting it to other uses, whilst some of the nuns were not properly provided with shoes, receiving only one pair each a year. Similarly as clothes, they scarcely received a single tunic in 3 years and a single cloak in 20 years, unless they were able to beg more from relatives and secular friends. It gets worse and worse, this. The prioress was a suspected woman, too credulous, and this is the Archbishop of York writing this, in an open letter to the convent, which is going to be read out in the chapter by his officials, with the prioress and the nuns all listening to this, bollocking, basically, which is coming from the Archbishop's office. The prioress was a suspected woman, too credulous and too ready of tongue, breaking out in correction ineffectively, and frequently for equal offences dealt unequal punishments, and with long continued hatred persecuted those amongst the nuns that she hated, until an opportunity came for wreaking her vengeance, so that nuns, when they realized that they would receive too heavy a punishment, contrived by the threats of their neighbors that the severity would be mitigated. There were many discords between the nuns and the sisters, and the sisters maintained that they were the equal of the nuns. These are the lay sisters. We have got vows. There's a dispute there, and that they should be able to wear the black veil like the nuns, which was not the custom of the house. Two windows through which the food and drink of the male canons were not properly kept by the nuns, who were called janitors, so that suspected confabulations between the canons on the one part and the nuns and sisters on the other, and the lay brothers, frequently took place as the nuns were providing the food to the canons and vice versa, and this had led to scandal and no little fornication. The door which led to the church was very carelessly kept by a secular servant who allowed the canons and lay brothers to enter in the dusk that they might hold conversations with the nuns and sisters. The door used to be diligently kept in the past by a faithful porter, but it was no longer the case. And the household of Robert de Hilton Knight wandered dissolutely about the cloister and the parlour, and in a very suspicious manner conversed with the nuns and sisters, whence danger was suspected. Robert himself was very troublesome, and for fear of his oppression, the canons of the house lately, without the consent of the convent, gave him a barn full of corn, which should have been for the maintenance of the convent, so that he would leave them alone and stop pestering them. The canons, under pretense of taking care of the external of the house of the property, had wasted it, which if carefully looked after would suffice for the maintenance of all, to the extent that now the nuns were only receiving bread, cheese, and ale, and on 2 days in the week they only had water, and they were starving. The canons, however, were having plenty and were daintily provided for. It was found that the house of the nuns of Swine could not maintain any more nuns or sisters, and were now in debt to the tune of 140 marks at least, which is about £100, which would be nearly £1 million in today's money. And on that account, the Archbishop decreed that no one in the future was to be received as a nun or a sister without his consent, and until this debt and problems had been dealt with. The correction of these matters are not carried out soon. The Archbishop specially reserved himself to appoint a vicar regent in charge of the convent. And then we get more and more of these cases. It's already 1955, so I'm going to wrap up in 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to drop a bit. But you can see, I don't know if you counted 14. I think there was probably more than 14 points there. But some of them were really pretty serious. And these are repeated again, much the same, in 1289. And in 1289, we have another visitation, and it's a member of the St. Quentin family. St. Quentin is near Harpham by Driffield. It still is, you know, an important sort of a gentry family up there. And some of the daughters there, who have become nuns, get involved in cases of fornication with the monks. Ultimately, in 1289, the Archbishop gets fed up of this. And as far as we can tell, he kicks the canons out. And Swine now, from then on until its dissolution, becomes exclusively a nunnery of women. And surprise, surprise, once the men have gone, the problems start to disappear, and we don't get anywhere like the amount of complaints coming up in visitation returns. Although that is not entirely true. I mean, we do actually have one case, which is 20 years after, in 1306, when 1280s is when the male canons and lay brothers have gone, when Archbishop Greenfield has to write to the rural dean of Beverley to arrest and prosecute a case against John, the son of Thomas, the blacksmith of Swine, for fornication committed with Alice Martel, nun of Swine. A bit of rough, I suppose. One of the most astonishing, remarkable thing in those visitation returns of 1318, and actually the visitation returns of the Diocese of York are the best preserved in all of medieval English history, by fortuitous luck that they survived, but also the Archbishops of York were remarkably diligent, more so than most other bishops, in looking after their flock, is we get visitation returns of every sort of 10, every new archbishop for about 1280 right up to 1340. First thing they do is they go and visit their diocese in person, or they send out agents to every monastery, every friary, every convent, big parish churches, Beverley Minster, collegiate churches, and have an inspection. It's like Ofsted turning up, basically, and to working out, are you following the rule? Are your accounts in order? Are you doing everything? And stuff like that. And here's just one amusing sort of comparison in 1318. Archbishop Melton, in his visitation return, when he goes to Wilberforce, he does tell the nuns off, and you're going to get told off about a number of things, but normally it's squabbling, not being silent in church, not being silent in the cloister. It's something petty. You know, you've done something, you might have just wandered off for the day, or you've had visitors and stuff like that, but the visitors might just have been a friend. I mean, there's nothing particularly serious in these things. The worst thing that the nuns of Wilberforce are accused of is that they have taken to wearing scarlet robes, which are unseemly and cut in a curious fashion. And the Archbishop forbids this. This is in addition to their normal, they're Benedictines, so they should be wearing black and white nuns like the nuns in The Sound of Music, like Julie Andrews. And Dunburnholme, just by Pocklington, they're told off for wearing scarlet robes, like the nuns of Wilberforce, which are unseemly, but also are too short. What do you think Swine's done? When the Archbishop comes to Swine, they are wearing scarlet robes, which are too short and too tight. Like medieval hot pants, cut in a curious, unseemly fashion. And why? Why are you wearing it? But that is, I'm drawing towards the end of my talk because we've hit 8 o'clock. I don't want you to get restless. And I've given you a handout, and the rest in questions and answers we can deal with. And in the handout, you'll see there are, I'm afraid in small print apart from the first page, a description of Swine Priory at the very moment it is closed down. And it is dissolved in 1539 on, left a, do you know, I've given out the handout that had all my notes on. Is that the one that's got my notes on? No, it isn't. Some lucky person's got the handout with all my extra notes on. I tried to remember them. Right, Swine is one of the very last monasteries to be closed down on September the 9th. Nunkeeling is closed down the following day. Mew is then the very, very last one in December 1539. So they've actually been spared closure in 1537, even though it was under £200, Henry VIII ordered the smaller monasteries to be closed, and then the bigger ones follow. But Henry VIII and the Reformation, they had a real big problem with what to do with the nuns. It was much easier to close down a male monastery, but to close down a female monastery and make them basically homeless and pack them off with a pension, that was a real problem, because a male monk can go off and just become a parish priest or a chancery priest, and he can become Protestant quite easily, or he can find another job quite easily, but the options open to a woman are very, very, very difficult. And in fact, almost the only option open to a woman in the church throughout the Middle Ages was to become a nun or an anchorite. But the Reformation, Henry VIII just got rid of all that and made it illegal to be a nun. So what are you going to do with these women? So the closure of the nunneries is staggered, and the nuns are moved from nunnery to nunnery to nunnery as this monastic dissolution happens, like a pack of cards collapsing or dominoes. So Wilberforce, the nuns are closed in August 1539, then moved to Swine. You know, the nuns from Fickerton moved to Swine, and Swine is the last holding house. And here you have a list of the pensions that are given to the nuns. Now, Dorothea Knight is getting a wonderful £13, 6 shillings and 8 pence. That is a staggeringly generous pension. That would be about £60,000 in today's money as a pension. But then look at the rest. There are still, remarkably, 20 nuns existing at Swine. There probably only were about 30 to 40 at its very height before the Black Death. So there's no indication that, in spite of all this, that Swine Priory is declining or is unpopular. And you've got some important families there. And there's this huge amount of money which is paid to the prioress. But then 66 shillings, that's 20 shillings in a pound. That's only £3. Well, that's about £8,000 to £10,000 in today's money for the rest of your life as a pension. And don't forget, you've just lost your community. You've lost your accommodation. You've lost your bread, your ale, your drink, your food, your clothing, you know, and you've got no land to farm. So either your family are going to take you back, or actually as a nun, you're in deep trouble. And the fate of the nuns is a very, very sad one. The Cromwellian investigators who deliberately went out in 1534 to find fault with the monasteries, to dig up dirt to justify their dissolution, were surprisingly unsuccessful to find much wrong at Swine. However, they did find ultimately one nun who had been impregnated by a priest in 1536. Ironically, that priest actually turns out to be the vicar who's going to go off and become the Protestant first vicar of Swine. But the rest, he can find nothing wrong with them. Which is, in fact, most of the nuns at Swine, what I've given you this handout is details of what happened to them afterwards. And you can see that they lived, many of them into the 1580s, till 40 years after. There are two cases of two nuns here, is it Elizabeth Fern and another one, who actually set up house together and lived together. They often remember and stay in contact with each other, and they often remember each other in their wills. And they are very, very charitable. And most of them, over half of all the nuns anyway, when asked, voluntarily wished to retain their vows. Only a tiny handful ever seek dispensation to get married, which is rarely granted. In the case of Elizabeth Fern, which you've got on the second page of your handout, the long bit, she, do read for that, late in 1552, the Yorkshire commissioners, who they're paid pensions for life, so we get various moments, 1542, 1564, 1575, 1582, the pension lists are updated to check they're still alive. She lives right through and leaves a remarkable series of bequests to the poor of Hull, to the mending of the highways, to poor maids' marriages, to the poor of the East Riding, to the houses for her other sisters. And she leaves gold rings with turquoise, mazes with silver and gilt, several silver spoons, £10 in cash to the poor of Kingston upon Hull. It's an incredibly impressive record. The fate of the nuns was, however, was a sad, slow, lingering one. But most of them remained in contact with each other to some extent. As I said, often remembered each other in their wills. And the majority kept their vows, with only a few seeking dispensation to get married. In fact, somewhat ironically, it was frowned on by both the society and the increasingly Protestant government, which is still trying to work out what its religious policy was, who believed that vows once made as monks and nuns, even monastic vows, were still to be kept for life, even though it was now illegal to be a monk or a nun. So you just catch-22 completely if you're a monk, and even more so if you're a nun. Those who were taken back by their families fared best, as clearly in that case, that of the former head of the religious house, Dorothea Knight, who £60,000 is going to be okay. But the majority eked out their existence on a poor pension that became a pittance, because, as I've mentioned in previous talks, for the first time in 16th century England, that demon from America and the New World, not Donald Trump, but inflation, would appear, and it would erode the existence of these pensions. These pensions do not change. They do not keep pace with inflation, and they are for life. And these nuns, in many cases, are going to be pensioned off in their late 20s, early 30s, and live for a long time. So you can imagine 50, 60 years down the line, that £3 is going to be more than halved because of rising prices. So how they survived, goodness knows. In spite of their sins and failings, we should not look perhaps unduly unkindly perhaps on the nuns of Swine. Some undoubtedly had, as I said, been forced into the monastic life, partly under family pressure, and some were too young for any real vocation to have developed. Some felt they had little, no choice, or no alternative. And in many cases, as Barbara English pointed out to me, for a lot of women, they were being forced into what was potentially a brutalizing, abusive, and violent marriage arrangement with somebody else for political or financial reasons, which would have been a life of misery, in which a life in the convent would have seemed absolute freedom. Choices were not good for them. But even for that, even for those that didn't have a calling, I myself prefer to think that the sins and excesses of Swine show and illustrate their humanity, the humanity of these nuns, not so different from you and I. The last of the Swine nuns lingered into at least 1582, and at least 4, including the former prioress, were drawing pensions then 43 years after the closure and destruction of their convent. The last of the Yorkshire religious, that is all the monks, friars and nuns that would have numbered just over 1,000, nearly 1,100 in 1530, was a nun, Isabel Coxon of Hampole near Doncaster, who was still alive as late as 1602 and still drawing her pension of a meagre 40 shillings, £2, which now would have been the equivalent of 2 or 3 shillings from the impact of inflation, awarded to her over 60 years previously. Quite possibly, she outlived the Tudor dynasty, as it was succeeded by the Stuarts in January 1603. Swine, however, remains a rare and special place for the students of medieval monasticism, and is one of the very few surviving conventual nunnery churches which survive today and still are used for regular worship as a parish church. And inside even still includes 6 wonderful carved misericords or seats in the choir that the nuns would have sat on. And perhaps one other final legacy comes from Swine. Geoffrey Chaucer, if you do come to my talks in the Monk's Walk, Pilgrims and Poets, does mention Holderness in his famous Canterbury Tales. Joan Skirlaw was prioress of Swine in 1400, and she was sister to Walter Skirlaw, the Bishop of Durham, who built Skirlaw Parish Church, in which Swine Nunnery and Swine Parish is situated and still is today. And Chaucer would have known and met Bishop Skirlaw at court, and quite possibly based his tale of the prioress's tale on her, on the bishop's sister, Prioress Joan of Swine. She certainly matches Chaucer's description of a dainty woman with her dogs and chihuahuas and cats and her dainty morsels of flesh, because actually the nuns of Swine were accused of keeping cats in church and bring them to evensong with them. She matches Chaucer's description, and you'll know more on March the 12th. I will be studying the Prioress's Tale at the Monk's Walk on the back of your handouts. As you can see, there's an advert. And so I conclude my talk. Thank you. Okay. A bit now, I suppose. Let's play a bit of music now. Yeah, thank you. We should have a bit of music, then we're going to have questions and answers.
Some of you may remember that wonderful book, 1066 and all that. Anybody remember it? Yes. Well, it's a sort of spoof history of England. And at one point, there is Warwick the Kingmaker, his questionnaire if you want to be king of England. And it says, mother's name, if none, N-U-N, write none, N-O-N-E. A couple of things just before we go on to questions while you're thinking of some questions to ask. First of all, that Marcus mentioned right at the end there that it's a very rare thing to have a church using Cistercian buildings. That's because Cistercian abbeys were mainly out in the country and therefore weren't actually open to being reused. The only three other places in England and Wales where that happens is Home Cultrum in Cumbria, which is again, is the nave of a priory church. Margam in South Wales, again a nave of a priory church, and Abbeydor in Herefordshire, which is the chancel and the transepts, and Swine is in fact the chancel. The other little thing just to add in is that the mention of Corodians, a word you've probably not come across before, those who gave money to a monastery and, as it were, then got old age accommodation. The only place in England that I know of, and somebody may correct me on this, where Corodians' quarters still exist in the ruins is a place called Cleve Abbey in Somerset. And if you've ever been to an Oxford or Cambridge college, you will know that the old rooms are sort of grouped around staircases. So suites of rooms, and that's what the Corodians' rooms, sort of suites, were like at Cleve. And as far as I know, it's the only place in England where such accommodation still exists. So now we come to questions. What I will do, as I always do, is come down, give you the microphone, and let you ask your question, and then Marcus will try and answer. So, yeah, I see one.
It's not so much a question as a point of information. There used to be some part medieval vestments at Marton near Burton Constable. I first saw them some 40 years ago, and I was told by the chapel looked after the house and the church for the Constable family that they came from Swine.
Really?
And that one of the constables...
Is that the Everingham house near Pocklington? Well, the big Roman Catholic chapel of
this
1829.
is Martin, Burton Constable Hall. Martin in Holderness.
Oh, really? Okay, in Holderness, gosh. The constables got around everywhere, didn't they? Yes.
And William Constable of the... William Constable, who is featured in an exhibition in the hall, built a church there in 1789.
Yes. It's the oldest Roman Catholic church in the country, isn't it?
And there were 3 vestments there at one time. I don't know where they are now, probably better preserved, but they were in the, basically what had been the priest's house, but an elderly couple lived there then. And they told me that the vestments were from Swine, and that one of the constables acquired them at the time of the dissolution.
It could well have done, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. And the constable were the leading Roman Catholic family of the 16th and 17th century. You've heard in my talk in one of those visitation returns that one of the nuns in one of those visitation returns did have Constable as her surname. The Constable family also don't just build Burton Constable Hall, but Everingham Hall near Pocklington, that's also the Constable family. The Constable family are also involved in around Whitby area as well. And Everingham Chapel is one of the biggest, most magnificent Roman Catholic churches ever built in this country in 1829 as a parish church, and it's full of vestments saved from pre-French revolutionary French convents and stuff like that. And the fact that the Misericords survive, they're the only known nuns Misericords to survive in the country, and the survival rate of convent monastic houses is almost negligible. We've got a staircase in Yorkshire. All you've got, apart from Swine Priory Church, is you've got a buttress at Wilberforce, incorporated in the current parish church, although the parish church is of the same date as the priory. But and in Rosedale, you've got a bit of a staircase in a turret. Most priories were built out of wood and thatch and stone, and were quite poor, so we don't find much of them. But it wouldn't surprise me that vestments there are near family, and we do sometimes find cases of, Flamborough Church has got the rood screen, either from Bridlington Priory or somewhere else, which has moved there. And Yorkshire has, and this is going to be one of my talks later on, is Easter Still Allowed, the next talk but one, has one of the highest rates of Catholic survivalism, right through until the 17th century. And there's clear evidence in lots of cases in Wilberforce churchyard from the monastery. Their monastic cross is buried in the churchyard by the church wardens, the Dolman family, and it's dug up again in the 18th century. The Archbishop of York is still trying to get rid of some of the nuns' stuff in 1724. There's a lot of stuff that survives right until the English Civil War that starts to go. So it wouldn't surprise me, and it wouldn't surprise me more and more stuff starts to turn up. You might have just seen on BBC News just the other day, at the Bar Convent in York, they've just discovered a medieval manuscript of 1475 of some of the nuns' prayers, and which is now being used. That was just last week. So there are still new discoveries, and particularly in the case of female monasticism, which has been so overlooked.
Okay, any more? Yes, one at the back here. Thank you. Just keep it close.
Not very confident using these sort of things. You touched on briefly mentioning about anchorites. I had a question about sort of anchoresses in the north of England. I've tried to do a bit of research on them, and I feel like there's quite little known about their lives. I just wondered if you had any more information as to whether there was anchoresses or anchorites attached to, the Minster here, or
Yes.
at Watton
Yes.
Abbey.
Yeah, and there were 2 or 3 anchorites in Beverley, and 2 or 3 hermits. The leading study is by a woman called Rotha Mary Clay, The Hermits and Anchorites of England, which, if you give me your details after, I'll show that to you and I'll get you a copy. But she was writing as early as 1924, and she did the first study, and she actually creates in that, in 1924, self-trained historian, a woman historian from Girton College, before they even admitted them to degrees, and she, daughter of a vicar, produces in that this wonderful database of all the anchorites and hermits that she found in all of England, and she identifies about 700 to 800, and details of them, details the dates, their names, where they lived, a bit of biographical detail about it. And we don't really have any. She also does a similar study of medieval hospitals in England, and she was a groundbreaking historian. And Eileen Power in 1924, also from Girton, does a study of medieval English nunneries. But anchorites, yes, so anchorite, by the way, is a female hermit. Male hermit goes off like crazy hermit in the forest, lives there by himself, trying to get away from everybody and lead a spiritual life, communing with nature and praying, and people keep irritatingly annoying, turning up and stopping him in solitude to ask for spiritual advice and guidance, and all he wants to do is be left alone. That's why I came here. But and he can fend for himself. Anchorite, the female equivalent, but because obviously they can't really go off and live in the woods because they'll get kidnapped, raped, abused, ravished by brigands, they have a sort of extension built onto the Minster or St. Mary's, and they're walled up for the rest of their life in a prison cell, and food is given to them and drinks given to them by people who again keep coming to them for advice. You do have occasions of actually sometimes two anchorites living together, so that must have been a little bit more fun. All Saints North Street in York, the anchorite cell there, all in York, All Saints North Street, York's best preserved medieval church, was the prick of conscience window with the best medieval stained glass after York Minster. The anchorite cell there is still preserved from the 14th century. And it's like a thatched building on the side of the church. It's in the centre of York, North Street, near Rougier Street, a bit down from the railway station near Lendal Bridge. But yes, there are at least 2 or 3 anchorites in Beverley. Talk to me afterwards, I'll give you lots. Manchester University Press has just recently published an anthology of sources of hermits and anchorites in medieval England just a few years ago, which is a great study. Okay.
Can I just add that there is actually, you'll often hear of references to lepers' squints in church, and there's kind of angled. Now, very often they aren't, or at least that's the theory. And there is one at Swine, so although I'm not sure there's any evidence of an anchoress at Swine, but there is certainly a so-called leper's squint, which might, and I can't think that why they would have had one at Swine, or but it might have been an anchoress, who knows?
Could have been.
But it's certainly still there. The one surviving one, although the church had to be rebuilt after the Blitz, that you can still see the arrangement, is St. Julian's Church in Norwich, the famous St. Julian of Norwich. And you still got her cell, and then the window, which is at an angle so that she can see the high altar during the celebration of Mass, but people can't see her.
There was actually also a slight halfway house here, because I mean, the anchorite life is mind-boggling, isn't it, really? I mean, you know, I'd much rather be a hermit in the forest, being free, rather than locked up in a tiny cell for the rest of your life, and you can't leave at all. And literally, when you do your pee and your poo, somebody's got to take it out through the window and come back to you, for goodness sake, grief. And listen to the die. But there's a halfway house.
Any more questions?
Oh, but to explain the halfway house, monasteries established what they called hermitages. It's very possible that convents of nuns established whatever the anchorite equivalent would be. So they were a little daughter chapel where one of the monks would live for a year or 2 by themselves from the monastery, but then they'd come back to the monastery after 2 years. So possibly nuns had a similar arrangement.
Yeah, may have done, yeah. Any more questions?
Roger.
Oh, sorry, Roger, I didn't see you there.
Thank you very much for that, Marcus. It does raise the issue of evidence a lot, doesn't it? First of all, the lack of evidence, the relative lack of evidence. And secondly, the fact that the evidence that we have, we always have to make allowances for the stance of the people giving the evidence or recording the evidence. And, for example, official church evidence. You've got to weigh up whether they have any interest in distorting the truth or constructing stories. And there's a lack of evidence from certain people who don't leave any.
Absolutely, and that's what's bedeviled the study of nunneries. We have lots of medieval monastic evidence for the male monasteries, lots of surviving chronicles, cartularies, and other documents. We do have also state records of fines and disagreements that they've had. So, for instance, that stuff about the Mew Abbey and Swine over the land and the gifts, that just comes from the sheriff's court and stuff. But there's not a single surviving female monastic chronicle. And there's only one surviving cartulary, which is a list of all the lands throughout all of Yorkshire, and that comes from Nunkeeling. We know next to nothing in the past about women, and that's what's made it such a problem. To the extent we're not even quite sure how well educated some of the convents actually really were. But recently, as you saw what Sarah Rees-Jones at York University, the head of history there, has been doing, and because quite a few of the Archbishop of York's registers, particularly William Melton's, which runs into about 10 to 11 volumes, we've only actually transcribed and translated up to volume 6 at the moment. We've still got 5 more to work through. And there's still a couple of volumes for the East Riding. And we've got his successors. There's an ongoing database project to translate all of these registers. It's going to probably take 10, 20, 30 years. He's going to transcribe them from the spidery handwriting into medieval Latin and then translate it again. But that will reveal a lot more. And that's why we're beginning to discover more about nuns through those archbishop registers. But we do still have, like the Bar Convent thing, the occasional thing. It doesn't happen, but every 2 or 3 years, there is a medieval document that does turn up in some library somewhere, in some stately home, or between the pages of a book. So there is hope yet.
Any more questions? Good. Well, that's great. As I say, if Swine is not easy to get into, I took Marcus down there, and it was open for a while, but it's not now. There used to be a notice saying where the key was, but if you don't know where it is, if you go down the A1, I think it's the 165. So when you get to sort of the big roundabout, and you sort of go off left to sort of Hornsey, and if you turn right and go down through Skirler, you'll then see signposts when you get to Coniston. For Swine. And it's certainly worth looking at on the outside, even if you can't get there in the inside. And if you happen to see some old book in the library or print, you will see that until about 1800, there was the remains of the original tower, and you can just see the little bits of the truncated bits of the transepts and just a stump of the nave. But that was all demolished. And a new tower was put on. So all you've got now, but it's got a very, very fine east window, great, massive east window. So it is a lovely building, even from the outside. And if anybody finds out how to get in, please let me know. And I think Marcus thinks we'd love to know how to get into it. One more piece of music, I think, would be lovely if you... Two final things. One is we do welcome donations. We suggest £5. Obviously, the Minster has to be lit and everything, and there are expenses associated. But any profits go to the Minster itself. And just to remind you again of the next one on the deserted villages of Yorkshire coming up in late March. So thank you and good night. Well, I mean, it's... Probably, yeah. Trouble is, Vicarage Skirler covers by umpteen parishes, and, but I mean, obviously affected whether they part with the key or not. I think I heard from my dog, or they were. Yes, but there used to be somebody in the village who I knew as a boy, and I think she was obviously worked on. For a time, it's actually left over, but it seems recently it's closed again. So, and it is worth seeing. Very simple. Yes, and the book, not Alabar. let's say, I took Marcus thinking it would go, it wasn't, but we haven't got round to going again yet. But, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, and swine Ellaby and swine Ellaby and then it just we're just saying. Oh, look, don't worry, I will give the bit. Yeah, that's I say, the last time I went, I expected to be open. That gives you the fates of all the nuns. Some of them say it's very good. I mean, what I find impressive is that Tudor. Yes, fine. Yeah. Yes, it's very bad that but now it's more, I think, cultural. But yes, it looks lovely inside now. They haven't tried to put back in it's very open, like a nice. Yes. I saw it before the fire first. But yes, it's Margam Abbey in South Wales, not far from Swansea. Now, also and the pictures and then as I say, I think the most attractive ship that they have now that's on Chance and Chance, so it's the most substantial remains. But I always think it's ironic, the Muse was the big, the vast ring, having it, there's nothing left of that, where swine is still being worshipped